You're 15 years old, barefoot on sun-warmed stone, watching your father's sheep drift between olive trees. The Aegean wind carries salt and thyme, and you hum a melody your mother taught you while mending a torn hem. In 3 years, maybe 4, you'll marry the baker's son. Your children will grow up knowing these same hills, this same sky. You don't know that the drumming sound rising from the harbor isn't thunder. You don't know that within the hour, your name will be the first thing stolen from you. Before we go further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It never stops amazing me how a story from 400 years ago can reach someone halfway across the world, right now, because of what happened to one girl on a Greek island. The men who came to Tinos in 1604 weren't pirates. They were professionals. Ottoman slave raiders operated with the precision of a military unit, and they had quotas to fill. The empire's appetite for human capital was insatiable. Palace servants, concubines, soldiers, administrators. The most valuable commodity in the Mediterranean wasn't silk or spices. It was children, specifically children who could be erased and rebuilt. Anastasia, the shepherd girl with dark eyes and surprising literacy for someone of her station, checked every box. The Genoese traders who sold intelligence about vulnerable islands had described Tinos perfectly. Isolated, under-defended, populated with Greek Orthodox families who would fetch premium prices in Constantinople's markets. What Anastasia experienced in those next hours is documented not by her voice. She left no diary, no letters, but by the silence in Venetian records. An entire generation of Tinos children simply vanished from census documents between 1604 and 1605. The raiders didn't need to kill anyone. The threat was enough. Parents who hid their children watched their homes burn. Parents who cooperated got to keep their lives, if not their sanity. The transaction was clean, efficient, and repeated across dozens of islands every year. Anastasia was chained to 11 other girls, force-marched to the coast, loaded onto a galley where she couldn't see the sky, and delivered to a world where everything she understood about being human would be systematically dismantled. The slave market in Constantinople had a smell that survivors described decades later in court testimonies. Unwashed bodies, yes, but also fear a specific chemical scent that buyers had learned to detect and discount when evaluating merchandise. Anastasia stood on a platform while strangers examined her teeth, pulled her hair to check thickness, pressed fingers against her scalp to assess bone structure. The Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch who managed imperial acquisitions, saw something the others missed. Not just beauty, though she had that. Not just intelligence, though he tested her literacy on the spot and found her sharper than most noble-born girls. He saw adaptability. The way her eyes tracked conversations she couldn't yet understand, absorbing patterns, calculating survival routes. He paid 300 gold sultani for her, 3 times the average price, and brought her to Topkapi Palace with a single instruction: make her forget she was ever Greek. They renamed her Mapiker, moon-faced. The name wasn't poetic, it was strategic. Every time someone spoke to her, she would be reminded that her old identity was dead. The harem where she now lived wasn't a brothel, though European fantasies would later paint it that way. It was a school for power, and the curriculum was survival. 200 women lived in a warren of rooms where every friendship was a potential betrayal, and every kindness concealed calculation. The women who thrived here didn't do so through beauty alone. They mastered something far more valuable: the ability to make others underestimate them while they studied weaknesses. built alliances with eunuchs who controlled access to the Sultan, and positioned themselves for opportunities that might not come for years. Mahpayker's education began immediately. Ottoman Turkish, Persian poetry, Quranic recitation, calligraphy, music, embroidery, court etiquette, political history. But the real lessons happened in the silences between formal instruction. How to read a rival's intentions in the tilt of her head. How to curry favor with senior concubines without threatening them. How to present absolute submission while quietly maneuvering for advantage. The woman who became her mentor, an aging Georgian concubine named Razieh, told her something she never forgot. In this place, the women who ask for power are destroyed. The women who accumulate it silently become sultanas. The harem hierarchy was brutal in its clarity. New girls started as chirak, apprentices, doing menial labor. Those who showed promise became kalfas, skilled servants. The truly exceptional became gozdes, in the eye of the Sultan women, granted the possibility of a single night in the imperial bedroom. Most gozdes returned to obscurity. Some became iqbals, official favorites with their own apartments. And a tiny fraction, maybe one in a generation, became Haseki chief consort, with political power that rivaled the Sultan's own mother. Mahpayker studied every woman who had made that climb, and she noticed something the others seemed to miss. The successful ones had all arrived during moments of political chaos, when the existing power structure was vulnerable to disruption. In 1605, that chaos arrived. Safiye Sultan, the ruthless Validi who had dominated imperial politics for a decade, was banished to the old palace. Handan Sultan, mother of the new Sultan Ahmed I, was visibly weakening from illness that would kill her within a year. The court was fractured, with competing factions positioning for influence over a 14-year-old ruler who had inherited an empire in crisis. Into this vacuum stepped a Greek girl who had spent her captivity learning to hide ambition behind carefully constructed displays of devotion. When Ahmed first saw Mahpayker, he was 15 years old, drowning in a position he'd never been prepared for. His father had died suddenly. His mentally unstable older brother had been bypassed for the throne. Every advisor who smiled at him wanted something. Every decision he made enriched someone while impoverishing someone else. The pressure was existential and unrelenting. And here was a girl, barely older than himself, who listened without apparent agenda, who asked intelligent questions about the books he was reading, who seemed genuinely interested in his thoughts rather than merely his power. What Ahmed couldn't see was how completely that appearance had been engineered. Mahpayker had studied him through networks of servants and eunuchs. She knew he loved poetry, particularly Fuzuli's work. She knew he felt insecure about his youth. She knew he craved companionship that felt real in a world of performance. She gave him exactly what he needed, one carefully calibrated conversation at a time. The transformation from Mahpayker to Kösem, leader of the Youths, a reference to her shepherd origins that Ahmed found charmingly humble, marked her ascension to Haseki Sultan. The title came with a salary of 1,000 aspers per day, making her wealthier than most European nobles. More importantly, it came with access. She began attending meetings, not officially, but through a screened partition where she could listen without being seen. She built relationships with key Janissary commanders by channeling their requests directly to Ahmed with her endorsements. She cultivated religious scholars who could provide theological cover for the reforms she was already planning. The frightened teenager who had wept in the slave market was now building a shadow government. The children came fast. Mehmed in 1605, Murad in 1612, Suleiman in 1615, Ibrahim in 1615. 4 sons, 4 potential sultans, and under traditional Ottoman law, that meant 3 of them were guaranteed to die. The practice of royal fratricide, legally codified by Mehmed the Conqueror, dictated that each new sultan must kill all his brothers to prevent civil war. Kösem had been enslaved by Ottoman violence. She had adapted to Ottoman systems, but she would not watch her sons murder each other. This was the line she chose to fight on, and it revealed the full evolution of her strategic thinking. She didn't argue with Ahmed directly. Instead, she cultivated relationships with progressive ulama who had already begun questioning fratricide on religious grounds. She arranged for Ahmed to discover treatises, suggesting that imprisonment of princes might satisfy both Islamic law and dynastic stability. She orchestrated conversations where trusted advisors happened to mention the public relations cost of royal murders. And critically, she made it personal. She wept when discussing the fate of Ahmed's own brother Mustafa, imprisoned since childhood in the cafes, the cage where spare princes lived in luxurious solitary confinement. When Ahmed finally announced the end of fratricide in favor of imprisonment, it looked like his idea. European ambassadors credited his mercy. Religious scholars praised his piety. Nobody realized that a former slave had just rewritten Ottoman constitutional law. Ahmed's death in 1617 should have ended Kösem's story. She was 32 years old, the mother of princes in a system that traditionally eliminated such women as threats to new regimes. But Ahmed's replacement was his brother Mustafa, the mentally unstable prince who had spent 13 years locked in the cafes. His grip on reality was so tenuous that within 3 months, a coalition of religious and military leaders determined he had to be removed. The question was, who would replace him? Ahmed's sons were too young to rule. The empire needed an adult sultan, but the only other option was returning Mustafa to power, which everyone agreed was impossible. Into this constitutional crisis stepped Kösem, with a solution so audacious that it took everyone by surprise: put her 11-year-old son Murad on the throne with her as regent. The precedent for female regency in the Ottoman Empire was thin to the point of non-existence. Islamic legal scholars debated whether a woman could legitimately wield executive authority. Conservative janissaries grumbled that rule by a woman violated natural law. But Kösem had spent years building alliances precisely for this moment. Key military commanders owed their positions to her patronage. Influential ulama remembered her charitable endowments. Palace administrators knew she understood imperial machinery better than most grand viziers. Most crucially, there was simply no better option. The empire was surrounded by enemies: Persia to the east, European powers to the west, rebellion simmering in Anatolia. Instability would be fatal. So the impossible happened. The slave girl from Tinos became the de facto ruler of an empire spanning 3 continents. The regency years were a masterclass in invisible governance. Kösem never issued decrees in her own name. She worked through proxy relationships, speaking suggestions to the Grand Vizier that everyone understood as commands. She attended meetings behind screens, her voice carrying weight precisely because it remained disembodied, almost mystical. Foreign ambassadors struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The Venetian Bailo wrote in 1625, "The empire is governed by a woman who was once a slave, yet whose intelligence exceeds that of most men I have met." But governance meant more than political maneuvering. The empire's treasury was depleted by decades of military campaigns. Corruption had become systemic, with provincial governors treating their territories as personal fiefdoms. The Janissaries, once the elite core of Ottoman military power, had become a violent interest group that toppled sultans who threatened their privileges. Kösem addressed these crises not through dramatic reforms, but through patient, unglamorous administrative work. She reorganized tax collection to reduce skimming by corrupt officials. She cultivated relationships with frontier generals, ensuring their loyalty through personal correspondence and strategic marriages, linking their families to hers. She played janissary factions against each other, supporting one group's demands while quietly funding their rival's position, maintaining a balance that prevented any single faction from becoming powerful enough to threaten the throne. The most delicate challenge was managing Murad himself. As he aged, the boy sultan began chafing at his mother's control. By his late teens, Murad was physically imposing, temperamentally violent, and deeply resentful of living in his mother's shadow. Kösem had created her own succession problem. She had raised a son to rule, and now he wanted to. The tension exploded in 1632, when Murad, now 20, began executing officials whom he suspected of being more loyal to his mother than to him. The public justification was always corruption or incompetence, but everyone understood the real message. The regency was ending. Kösem made a calculated retreat, withdrawing from visible politics while maintaining her networks. She had survived by knowing when to advance and when to become invisible. When Murad died in 1640, possibly poisoned, though contemporary sources are ambiguous, Kösem engineered the succession of her youngest son, Ibrahim. And here her judgment, usually so acute, finally failed. Ibrahim was mentally unstable, possibly damaged by growing up in the cafes where he'd been imprisoned after Ahmed's death. His reign was catastrophic. Paranoid purges, economic mismanagement, erratic foreign policy. Kösem tried to control him as she had controlled Murad, but Ibrahim was beyond reason. By 1648, the empire was in crisis again, and Kösem faced an impossible choice. She could support Ibrahim and watch the empire collapse, or she could support a coup that would put her grandson Mehmed IV on the throne. She chose the coup. They strangled Ibrahim with a bowstring while he begged for his life. The final years were a slow-motion tragedy. Kösem was now in her 60s, still sharp, but facing a new generation that resented her continued influence. Her grandson Mehmed was only 7, which meant another regency. But this time, Kösem had to share power with Mehmed's mother, Turhan Sultan. The two women represented different eras of Ottoman politics. Kösem embodied the Sultanate of women, when female intelligence had genuinely shaped imperial policy. Turhan represented a newer, more conventional approach that viewed female power as an aberration to be corrected. The conflict was generational, philosophical, and ultimately lethal. The night of September 2, 1651, soldiers loyal to Turhan entered Kösem's apartments. The old woman, she was 66, understood immediately what was happening. She tried to hide, but there was nowhere to go. They strangled her with curtain cords, the same method used for Ibrahim. Her body was found hours later, a former slave who had ruled an empire, killed by the system she had mastered but never fully escaped. The burial was quick and quiet. No state funeral, no public mourning. The woman who had shaped Ottoman politics for 4 decades was interred in a modest tomb beside Ahmed IV, her husband who had died 34 years earlier. Within a generation, her story had been simplified into legend, the clever concubine who rose from slavery to power. But the archives tell a different story. They show a woman who understood systems better than the men who designed them, who turned powerlessness into strategy, and who recognized that the most dangerous revolutions happen silently, one invisible decision at a time. Today, tourists walk through Topkapi Palace, photographing tile work and fountains, mostly unaware that the marble corridors once trembled at the whispered word of a woman whose name they've never heard. But in the administrative records, in the diplomatic correspondence stored in archives from Vienna to Venice, the evidence remains of what she accomplished. She ended fratricide. She stabilized an empire during its most vulnerable transition. She proved that political genius could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and that intelligence mattered more than legitimacy in the art of governance. Her story doesn't resolve into easy lessons. She was a victim who became a perpetrator, a slave who mastered her enslavers, a mother who engineered the death of her own son for reasons of state. She survived by understanding that power flows not from titles or legal authority, but from knowing what people want and positioning yourself as the only person who can provide it. The frightened 15-year-old who heard hoofbeats approaching her village became the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean world. And the price of that transformation was becoming someone who would have been unrecognizable to the girl who once tended sheep on a hillside. Humming songs her mother taught her, dreaming of a simple life that was stolen before she understood what she was losing.